fire had already reached the second barn when Alara ran through the smoke, her bare feet cutting on broken stone, her lungs burning with every breath. Behind her, the shouting grew louder. Men were fighting near the old gate, their voices rising over the crackle of flames, and somewhere in that chaos was her father, standing between two armies that had hated each other for 20 years. She did not scream. She never screamed, not since the night she lost her voice, but her silence had never stopped her heart from racing the way it raced now. She pressed herself against the crumbling wall of the courtyard and watched as her father, Edwin, walked forward with his hands raised, unarmed, toward a wall of warriors wearing black cloaks stitched with the crest of a wolf's head. At the front of that wall stood a man Alara had never seen before, but one she would never forget. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back from a face that looked carved from stone. His eyes were the color of a storm before it broke, gray and sharp, and when he looked toward the burning barn, something violent passed behind them, quickly hidden again. This was Ronan Blackthorn, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, a man whose name alone had ended battles before they began. Edwin's voice shook as he spoke. He offered peace. He offered land. He offered anything that might stop the war that had already cost both sides too much blood. Ronan said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until even the wind seemed to hold still. Then he asked for the one thing Edwin had been dreading to give. He asked for a bride. Alara heard the words from where she hid, and her whole body went cold. She understood, in that instant, exactly what was about to happen to her life. She was 17 the night she lost her voice, taken by fever after watching something no child should ever witness, and in the 6 years since, she had built a quiet world for herself, one built from gestures and glances and the small, safe rhythms of home. Now that world was about to be handed to a stranger with storm-gray eyes, as payment for a war she never started. Her father turned and searched the courtyard until he found her. His eyes were full of apology, but there was no hesitation in his voice when he called her forward. She stepped out from the shadows, and every warrior in that courtyard turned to look at her, the girl who did not speak, the daughter being traded like a piece on a board neither side controlled. Ronan studied her without blinking. She held his gaze, because looking away felt like losing, and she had already lost enough that night. He walked closer, his boots crunching over broken glass and ash, until he stood only a few feet from her. Up close, he was even more imposing, but there was something else in his expression too, something that looked almost like curiosity breaking through the ice. He asked her name. She did not answer. Her father answered for her, his voice tight with shame, explaining that his daughter could not speak, that she had not spoken in years, that whatever secrets she carried were locked behind a silence no healer had ever managed to break. Ronan's jaw tightened at this news. A silent bride was no ordinary prize. A silent bride could not swear an oath aloud in front of his pack. A silent bride could not be trusted the way tradition demanded. For a moment, Alara believed he would refuse her, would demand another daughter, another sister, anyone who could speak the vows his people required. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, turning it over gently, as if reading something written on her palm. His touch was warm, unexpectedly careful for a man who had walked into a burning courtyard without flinching. He said that silence was not weakness. He said a bride who did not speak might still keep a promise, better than one who spoke too freely. There was a murmur of surprise among his warriors, but none of them dared question their Alpha King. Alara did not know if she should feel relief or terror. She only knew that her life, the quiet, careful life she had built, was over the moment his fingers closed around hers. They left before sunrise. Alara was given only minutes to gather what little she could carry, a small bag with a change of clothes, a wooden comb that had belonged to her mother, and a folded piece of paper with her sister Ivy's handwriting on it, a note Ivy had pressed into her hand at the last second, tears streaming down her face, begging her to be careful, to find a way to send word, to survive whatever came next. The journey north took 3 days. Alara rode in a covered wagon with 2 silent guards, men who never looked directly at her, as if she were something fragile or something dangerous. She could not tell which. She watched the world change through a gap in the canvas, watched green hills turn into darker forests, watched the air grow colder with every mile. She thought of her father's face in that courtyard, the guilt written so plainly across it, and she wondered if she would ever see her family again. On the second night, the wagon stopped early. One of the guards, a younger man with kind eyes, brought her a plate of food and sat a respectful distance away while she ate. He did not know sign language, but he watched her hands when she gestured, trying to understand, and slowly, over that quiet meal, something like an unspoken understanding grew between them. He told her his name was Nate. He told her that the Alpha King was not the monster the Southern Pax believed him to be, that he had ended more wars than he had started, that his coldness was armor built from loss, not cruelty. Elara listened, filing away every word, searching for any clue about the man who now owned her future. They reached the Blackthorn stronghold on the third evening, just as the sun sank behind a ridge of dark mountains. The fortress rose out of the stone like something ancient, its towers sharp against the darkening sky, its walls thick enough to withstand any siege. Elara had never seen anything like it. Her own home had been modest, a farmhouse surrounded by fields and low fences, nothing like this cold, powerful place that seemed built to keep enemies out and secrets in. The gates opened before the wagon even stopped moving, and a crowd had gathered to see the silent bride arrive. Elara felt every eye on her as she stepped down, her legs stiff from days of travel, her heart pounding so loud she was sure someone could hear it. Whispers rippled through the crowd, sharp and curious, some laced with pity, others with open suspicion. A bride who could not speak was already strange enough. A bride traded to end a war made her stranger still. Ronan appeared at the top of the stone steps, having ridden ahead of the wagon on his own horse. He descended slowly, his presence commanding silence from the crowd before he even opened his mouth. When he reached her, he did not offer comfort or warmth. He simply told her, in a voice meant only for her ears, that she was safe within these walls, as long as she caused no trouble, and that any attempt to escape would be met swiftly. It was not cruelty in his tone, Elara realized, but caution, the caution of a man who had been betrayed before and refused to be caught unprepared again. She was led inside by a stern older woman named Faye, who managed the household with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue. Faye explained the rules of the stronghold as they walked, her voice brisk and businesslike, clearly unbothered by the fact that her new charge could not answer back. Meals were served at set times. Certain wings of the fortress were forbidden. The Alpha King was not to be disturbed after sunset, unless the matter was urgent. Elara absorbed every word, understanding that knowledge would be her only weapon in this unfamiliar world. Her room, when she finally reached it, was larger than anything she had known before, with a stone fireplace already lit and heavy curtains drawn against the mountain wind. It should have felt like comfort. Instead, it felt like a cage, dressed up to look like a gift. She sat on the edge of the bed, long after Faye left, staring at the flickering fire, replaying the events of the last 3 days, over and over, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a restless sleep. She woke before dawn, to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window. Careful not to be seen, she crept to the glass and looked down into the courtyard, where Ronan stood, facing a group of his senior warriors, including a sharp-featured man with quick, assessing eyes, who Elara would later learn was named Corin, the Alpha King's beta and closest advisor. Their argument was too distant to make out clearly, but Corin's gestures toward the tower where she slept made the subject obvious enough. They were arguing about her. She could not hear every word, but she understood enough from the tension in their bodies. Corin did not trust her. He believed a silent bride was the perfect disguise for a spy, someone who could listen to everything and report nothing, someone whose silence made her impossible to interrogate. Ronan's response was harder to read. He did not defend her outright, but he did not agree with Corin either. He simply ended the conversation with a sharp word and walked away, leaving his beta staring after him with obvious frustration. Elara returned to her bed, but sleep did not come again that night. She understood now that her arrival had not simply ended a war. It had started a new kind of battle, quieter but no less dangerous, one where her only weapons were patience and the careful reading of people who did not yet trust her enough to reveal their true intentions. The following morning, Faye arrived early, with a simple dress and instructions to prepare for a formal introduction to the pack. Elara dressed in silence, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, and allowed herself to be led through the fortress toward the great hall. where dozens of pack members had gathered to see their Alpha King's new bride for the first time in daylight. The hall was vast, its high stone ceiling supported by wooden beams darkened with age, and every face turned toward her as she entered. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to let her fear show, remembering the quiet strength her mother had once told her lived inside every person who learned to survive without words. Ronan stood at the far end of the hall, waiting, his expression unreadable as she crossed the distance between them. When she reached him, he took her hand once more, this time in front of his entire pack, and spoke the words of the formal introduction himself, since she could not. His voice carried easily through the hall, steady and sure, declaring her his bride and under his protection, though he stopped short of naming her his mate, a distinction that did not go unnoticed by the sharper members of the crowd. Elara felt the weight of every unspoken judgment pressing against her skin, but she did not look away from him, and for the first time since her father called her forward in that burning courtyard, she felt something shift inside her, small and fragile, but real. She was not simply a prize traded for peace. She was about to become something this fortress had never seen before, a woman whose silence would prove louder than any voice in that hall, if only someone was willing to listen. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse into quiet conversation, Elara caught Corin watching her from across the hall, his expression sharp with suspicion that had not softened despite the formal declaration. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, refusing to be the first to look away, and something in her steady, unflinching stare seemed to unsettle him more than any words could have. Whatever battle lay ahead within these stone walls, Elara understood now that it would not be fought with weapons or war councils. It would be fought in silence, in glances, in the small spaces between words where truth either hid or revealed itself, and she intended to win it. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, one Elara had not expected to find inside a fortress ruled by a man everyone feared. Faye woke her each morning, before the sun cleared the mountains, dressed her in simple wool and linen, suited to the cold northern air, and walked her through the long stone corridors, as though teaching a child the shape of a new world. Elara memorized everything, the location of the kitchens, the narrow staircase that led to the training yard, the heavy oak door that Faye always warned her never to open, the one leading to the Alpha King's private study. It was on the fourth morning that she first heard the pack members speaking freely about her. Unaware, she stood just around the corner of a stone archway. Two young women, servants by the look of their aprons, whispered to each other about the silent bride, wondering aloud what kind of woman agreed to marry a stranger without protest, without even a word of complaint. One of them suggested, in a voice not nearly quiet enough, that perhaps Elara could not protest, because she was hiding something far worse than sadness. The other laughed, but there was an edge to it, the kind of laughter people used when they were uneasy rather than amused. Elara did not confront them. She could not have, even if she wanted to. But more than that, she understood that reacting would only feed the story growing around her. Instead, she walked past them with her chin level and her expression calm, letting her silence answer for her in the only way it could, and she noted, quietly, that fear disguised as gossip traveled faster in this fortress than anywhere she had lived before. Corin found reasons to appear wherever she went. At first she thought it might be coincidence, but by the end of the first week, she recognized the pattern for what it was. He was watching her, testing her, waiting for some slip that would prove his suspicions correct. He would appear in the library while she browsed the shelves, always with some excuse about needing a particular book, and he would linger nearby, observing which text she reached for, which pages she lingered on. She began choosing books deliberately, old histories and simple poetry, nothing that might feed his theory that she was gathering information for some enemy, though the effort of managing his suspicion on top of everything else left her exhausted by evening. Ronan, by contrast, was rarely present at all. He spent his days in council meetings and training with his warriors, his evenings behind the closed door of his study, and Elara saw him mostly at the formal dinners Faye insisted she attend, seated beside him at the head of a long table filled with pack leaders and their families. He spoke little to her during these meals, though she noticed he always made certain her plate was filled, always noticed if she seemed cold, and had someone bring a shawl before she could ask, though asking, of course, was never something she could do aloud. It was during one of these dinners, on the seventh night, that Alara first understood how closely he had already begun paying attention to her, more than his cool distance suggested. A visiting pack leader from the Eastern Territories made a careless remark about silent brides being useless in matters of diplomacy, unable to negotiate, unable to reassure allies with their own words. The comment was clearly meant as a joke, but the table grew quiet, waiting to see how the Alpha King would respond to an insult aimed, even lightly, at his bride. Ronan set down his cup slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same command it held in the courtyard the night they met. He said that his bride's silence had already told him more truth than most men manage to speak in a lifetime, and that a woman who chose her words so carefully, when she had them to choose, was worth more at any negotiating table than a man who wasted breath on empty jokes. The visiting leader flushed and apologized quickly, and the conversation moved on, but Alara sat frozen for a long moment, stunned by the unexpected defense. She glanced at him, and for just a moment, their eyes met across the table. He did not smile. His expression remained as controlled as ever, but something passed between them in that brief look, an acknowledgement that neither of them fully understood yet, but that both of them had noticed all the same. That night, unable to sleep, Alara found herself wandering the fortress halls long after most of the household had gone to rest. She told herself she was simply restless, but some part of her recognized she was searching for something, though she could not have named what. She passed the training yard, empty and silver under the moonlight, and continued toward the eastern wing, a part of the fortress she had not yet explored. She found him there, alone in a small courtyard garden she had not known existed, sitting on a stone bench beneath a bare winter tree, staring up at the stars with an expression far more open than any she had seen on him before. He looked younger somehow, the weight of his title set aside for these private, unguarded moments. Alara hesitated at the edge of the garden, unsure whether to retreat before he noticed her, but it was too late. He had already sensed her presence, his head turning toward the shadows where she stood. He did not ask why she was awake, or scold her for wandering the fortress at night. He simply gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him, an invitation rather than a command, and after a moment's hesitation, Alara crossed the garden and sat down, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. They sat in silence for a long while, though it was not the same silence that filled the great hall during formal dinners, heavy with judgment and unspoken questions. This silence felt different, almost comfortable, as though two people who had no reason to trust each other were slowly, carefully, learning how to simply exist in the same space without demanding anything from one another. Eventually, Ronan spoke, his voice low, meant only for her. He told her about his first mate, a woman named Rosalind, who he had trusted completely, and who had betrayed him in a way that nearly cost him his throne and his life. He did not go into detail, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable, carefully controlled, but still present beneath the surface. He told her that since then, he had found it easier to rule through distance, that words had become dangerous things in his experience, easily twisted, easily used as weapons. Alara listened without interrupting, though of course interrupting was never something she could do. When he finished speaking, she reached into the small pouch she kept at her waist, and withdrew a folded scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal she always carried, a habit from years of communicating this way with her family. She wrote a single sentence and handed it to him. He read it slowly in the dim moonlight. It said simply that words could also heal, if the person speaking them meant everyone. Ronan studied the note for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, a gesture so small and yet so significant that Alara felt her heart tighten in her chest. From that night forward, something between them began to shift, slowly, carefully, like ice thawing beneath a layer of snow that showed no visible change on the surface. Ronan began seeking her out in small ways, walking with her through the fortress gardens in the early evening before dinner, asking her simple questions she could answer with a nod or shake of her head, learning the particular language of her expressions, the way one might learn a foreign tongue, patiently, one word at a time. Corin noticed the change immediately, and his suspicion, rather than fading, seemed to deepen with every small kindness Ronan showed her. He cornered Alara alone in the library on the 10th day, his voice sharp and low, warning her that he would be watching her closely, that he did not care how skillfully she had charmed his Alpha King, that the moment he found proof of deception, He would expose her regardless of the cost. Alara did not flinch from his warning. She simply held his gaze, steady and unafraid, and reached for her charcoal to write a response. She wrote that she understood his loyalty to his king and respected it, that she had no secrets to hide beyond the grief that had taken her voice, and that if he ever found proof otherwise, she would not fight his judgment. Corin read the note twice, his expression unreadable, before finally turning and walking away without another word. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Alara realized something had changed within herself as well. She was no longer simply surviving inside these fortress walls, counting days and waiting for some chance at freedom. She was beginning, cautiously, to build something here, fragile connections with a household that had feared and doubted her, and most unexpectedly of all, the beginnings of trust with a man who had sworn never to trust anyone again. She did not know yet whether this fortress would ever feel like home, or whether Ronan's guarded heart would ever fully open to a woman who could not speak the words most people relied on to prove their sincerity. But sitting by her window that night, watching the last candle flicker out in the tower, where the Alpha King kept his own restless watch, Alara allowed herself, for the first time since the night her father called her forward in that burning courtyard, to hope that whatever waited for her here might not be the cage she had once feared, but something far more complicated, and perhaps, if she was patient enough, something far better. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains as the weeks passed, and with it came a new kind of tension inside the Blackthorn stronghold. One Alara could feel, but not yet name. Supply wagons arrived less often. Warriors trained longer hours in the frozen courtyard, their breath rising in clouds against the gray sky. Ronan spent more time behind the closed door of his study, and when he did emerge, his face carried a weariness that had not been there during their quiet evenings in the garden. Alara noticed everything, the way she had always noticed things, sharpened by years of relying on observation rather than conversation. She noticed the messengers who arrived at strange hours, their horses lathered from hard riding. She noticed Corin's clipped tone growing sharper with the household staff, his patience thinning under some pressure she did not yet understand. She noticed, most of all, the way Ronan's shoulders carried more weight with each passing day, though he never spoke of it during their walks, changing the subject with practiced ease whenever she tried to ask. It was Faye who finally explained, though not by choice. Alara found her in the linen room late one afternoon, folding blankets with unusual force, muttering under her breath about fools who thought war was ever truly finished. When Alara touched her arm gently, asking without words what troubled her, Faye sighed and finally relented, explaining that a neighboring Alpha named Damon Voss had begun making trouble along the eastern border, testing the strength of the peace treaty that had brought Alara to this fortress in the first place. Damon Voss, Faye explained, had never wanted peace between the packs. He had built his own power on the promise of war, on convincing his people that only conquest could secure their future, and the treaty between Ronan and Alara's family had cut directly into his ambitions. If the northern and southern packs remained united, Damon's plans for expansion would collapse entirely. Faye's voice dropped lower as she added that some believed Damon would not simply accept defeat quietly, that a man who built his power on war rarely walked away from a battlefield without one final desperate strike. Alara absorbed this information with a growing unease that settled deep in her chest. She thought of her family, still living in the borderlands where this new conflict might unfold, and she thought of Ronan, carrying the weight of protecting two packs from a threat that had not fully shown its face yet. That evening, she waited for him in the garden, as she had many nights before, but he did not come, and she understood, without needing to be told, that he was buried too deep in council matters to steal even a few quiet minutes for himself. She returned to her room troubled, unable to shake the feeling that something dangerous was gathering just beyond the fortress walls, something that would eventually reach even the careful peace she had begun building here. She did not sleep well that night, her dreams filled with fire and shouting, echoes of the night her father handed her over in that burning courtyard, mixed now with new fears about a war that had not yet begun. The following days brought more signs of the growing tension. Ronan called an emergency council meeting that stretched late into the night, and Alara watched from the shadows of the corridor as pack leaders arrived with grim expressions, their voices low and urgent as they passed through the heavy doors of the council chamber. She could not hear the details of their discussion, but she recognized the particular quality of fear that hung in the air. the same fear she remembered from her childhood home, in the final days before the treaty was signed. Corin emerged from that meeting looking more troubled than she had ever seen him, and for once, when he passed her in the hallway, he did not pause to offer his usual suspicious glance. He simply nodded, distracted, his mind clearly occupied with matters far more pressing than the loyalty of a silent bride. Alara watched him go, and despite their difficult history, she found herself hoping he would find whatever answers he was searching for, because if war truly was coming, this fortress would need every capable mind it had. It was 2 days later that Ronan finally sought her out again, appearing in the garden just as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. He looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing his eyes, but he managed a small, tired smile when he saw her waiting on their usual bench. He sat beside her without speaking at first, simply staring out at the darkening horizon, and Alara let the silence stretch, understanding that sometimes the kindest thing she could offer was simply her presence, undemanding and patient. Eventually he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of the commanding edge he wore for his council and his warriors. He told her about Daemon Voss, confirming everything Faye had already shared, but adding details that made the threat feel even more immediate. Daemon had been spotted moving warriors along the border, far more than any legitimate patrol required. Scouts reported strange gatherings in the forests near the eastern territories, meetings that suggested Daemon was building alliances with smaller packs who resented the growing power of the Blackthorn stronghold. Ronan admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that he feared the peace he had worked so hard to secure might crumble before it ever truly had the chance to take root. He feared for his people, for the warriors who trusted him to protect them. And though he did not say it directly, Alara understood from the way his eyes lingered on her face that he feared for her as well, for the bride whose safety had become tangled up with a war she had never asked to be part of. Alara reached for his hand, a gesture she had never initiated before, always careful to let him set the pace of whatever was growing between them. He looked down at her hand in his, surprised but not unwelcoming, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, simply sitting together beneath the darkening sky, two people carrying burdens too heavy for words, finding a strange comfort in shared silence. She withdrew her charcoal and paper and wrote him a message, one she had been composing in her mind for days, without quite finding the courage to share it. She wrote that she had grown up watching her father try to protect his people through diplomacy and sacrifice, that she understood the cost of leadership even if she could never fully carry that burden herself, and that whatever came, she would not run from this fortress or from him, that her silence did not mean she lacked courage. Ronan read the note twice, his expression softening in a way Alara had rarely seen from him. He told her, quietly, that he believed her, that in the weeks since her arrival, he had come to trust her steadiness more than he trusted the loud reassurances of men who spoke freely but meant little. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he had said to her since their first meeting in that burning courtyard, and Alara felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the fear still coiled tightly beneath it. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps, and Corin appeared at the garden entrance, his face tight with urgency. He apologized for the intrusion, but explained that new scouts had returned with troubling news, that Daemon Voss had been seen personally at the border, a rare and significant move for an alpha, who typically sent lieutenants to handle such matters. Ronan rose immediately, his exhaustion replaced by sharp focus, the weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders, like a familiar cloak. Before he left, he turned back to Alara, his expression conflicted. He told her to stay within the fortress walls, to trust Faye and the household guards to keep her safe, and though his tone carried the authority of a command, there was something gentler beneath it, something closer to a plea. Alara nodded, understanding the weight behind his request, and watched as he followed Corin back toward the council chamber, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the stone corridors. She remained in the garden long after they left, staring up at the stars that had begun to emerge in the darkening sky, and she thought of her family in the borderlands, caught between two packs whose fragile peace now teetered on the edge of collapse. She thought of Ronan, carrying the weight of protecting everyone within his reach, even as his own past losses made trust and vulnerability feel like dangerous risks. And she thought of herself, no longer simply a silent bride traded to end one war, but somehow, without quite realizing when it happened, A woman who had begun to care deeply for the man she had been given to, and for the people who had slowly, cautiously, begun to accept her as one of their own. That night, as she finally returned to her room, Alara paused at her window, looking out over the fortress walls, toward the dark mountains beyond, where somewhere in the shadows, Damon Voss was gathering his forces for a conflict that threatened everything she had begun to build here. She did not know what the coming days would bring, but she understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that she would not stand by silently while the people she had come to care for faced this threat alone. Whatever role she could play, whatever small part her presence might serve in the battles ahead, she intended to find it, even if she had to fight this war, like everything else in her life, without a single spoken word. 3 days after Damon Voss appeared at the eastern border, the fortress transformed into something Alara had never seen before, a place preparing quietly for the possibility of war. Extra guards patrolled the walls through the night. The blacksmiths worked without rest, the ring of hammer against metal echoing through the courtyard from dawn until well past dark. Faye grew sharper and more efficient, organizing supplies with the practiced calm of someone who had lived through conflict before and knew exactly what preparation required. Alara found herself drawn into this preparation in small ways, despite Ronan's earlier request that she remain within the fortress walls. She began helping in the kitchens, where extra hands were needed to prepare food that could be stored and carried easily, if the warriors needed to move quickly. She helped roll bandages alongside the healers, her steady hands proving useful, even when her voice could not offer the reassurance the frightened younger servants sometimes needed. Slowly, the household staff who had once regarded her with suspicion began to see her differently, not as a strange, silent outsider, but as someone willing to work alongside them when it mattered most. It was during one of these long afternoons in the healer's quarters that Alara first met Grace, a young healer with quick hands and an even quicker mind, who did not seem bothered in the slightest by Alara's inability to speak. Grace filled the silence naturally with her own steady stream of conversation, explaining which herbs treated fever, which bandaging techniques worked best for different wounds, teaching Alara as though she were any other apprentice eager to learn. For the first time since arriving at the fortress, Alara felt something close to friendship blooming, uncomplicated by suspicion or fear, and she found herself looking forward to these afternoons more than she expected. Ronan, meanwhile, grew more distant as the threat from Damon Voss intensified, though Alara understood this distance came not from coldness, but from the crushing weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. She caught glimpses of him during council meetings that stretched late into the night, his voice carrying through the heavy chamber doors, sharp with the particular authority of a leader making decisions that would determine whether his people lived or died. She did not resent his absence. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to carry a burden too heavy to share, having carried her own silent grief alone for years before finding her way to this fortress. It was nearly a week later that the first real crisis arrived, breaking the fragile tension that had built steadily since Damon's appearance at the border. Scouts returned in the middle of the night, with news that sent the entire fortress into motion. Warriors rushing to the walls, horns sounding an alarm that Alara had never heard before, but understood instantly for what it meant. Damon Voss had crossed the border, not with his full army, but with a smaller force moving quickly toward one of the outlying villages under Blackthorn protection, a settlement too small to defend itself against even a modest attack. Alara woke to the sound of chaos, the fortress alive with shouting, and the clatter of warriors preparing for battle. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the courtyard, where she found Ronan already mounted, his expression hard and focused, giving orders to Corin and a dozen other warriors preparing to ride out into the darkness. She pushed through the gathering crowd until she reached him, and though she could not call out to stop him, she caught his attention, simply by the desperation in her eyes, as she looked up at him from beside his horse. He looked down at her, and for just a moment, the hardened warrior gave way to something softer, something afraid, though whether that fear was for himself or for her, Alara could not be certain. He reached down and brushed his fingers gently against her cheek, a rare public display of affection that drew murmurs from the warriors around them, and he told her, quietly, that he would return, that she needed to trust him the way he had come to trust her silence over these past weeks. Then he turned his horse and rode out through the fortress gates, his warriors following close behind, disappearing into the darkness toward the threatened village. The hours that followed were the longest Ilara had ever endured. She remained in the healer's quarters alongside Grace, preparing supplies for the wounded who would inevitably return from whatever battle unfolded in the darkness beyond the fortress walls. Faye moved among the household staff with grim efficiency, organizing everything from extra bedding to hot water, her own worry carefully hidden behind years of practiced calm. Ilara worked alongside them, grateful for the distraction, though her mind kept returning to Ronan riding into danger, his storm-gray eyes carrying a fear he rarely allowed himself to show. Dawn broke gray and cold, and still there was no word from the warriors who had ridden out hours before. Ilara climbed to the top of the eastern tower, joining a small group of anxious household members who had gathered there to watch for any sign of returning riders. The forest beyond the fortress remained still and silent, giving no hint of what had happened in the darkness, and every passing minute stretched the tension in Ilara's chest tighter, until she thought she might break from the weight of waiting alone. It was Faye who finally spotted them, a line of riders emerging from the tree line as the sun climbed higher into the pale morning sky. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat as she counted the returning figures, searching desperately for Ronan among them. And when she finally spotted his familiar broad shoulders near the front of the group, relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. The warriors returned battered but victorious, having driven off Damon's forces before they could reach the vulnerable village, though not without cost. Several warriors carried wounds that needed immediate attention, and Ilara rushed down from the tower to help Grace and the other healers, as the injured were brought into the courtyard. She worked without pause, cleaning wounds and helping stabilize warriors whose pain they could not fully express in words, drawing on skills she had only begun learning weeks before, grateful now more than ever for Grace's patient teaching. Ronan himself carried a wound along his forearm, deep enough to require careful stitching, though he insisted on remaining in the courtyard to oversee the care of his warriors before allowing anyone to tend to his own injury. It was only when Ilara approached him directly, her expression firm and unwavering, that he finally relented, allowing her to lead him toward the healer's quarters, where she could clean and dress the wound herself. She worked in silence, her hands steady, despite the emotion still churning inside her from the long night of waiting. Ronan watched her closely as she tended to his arm, his exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes, but there was also something else in his expression, a quiet gratitude that needed no words to be understood. When she finished, tying off the bandage with careful precision, he caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it gently between his own. He told her, his voice rough with exhaustion and unspoken emotion, that during the ride toward the village, in the chaos of the coming battle, his thoughts had kept returning to her, to the fear that he might not return to the fortress, to her. It was, he admitted, a distraction he could not afford, as a leader responsible for the lives of his warriors, and yet he found he could not regret it, could not wish away the depth of feeling that had grown between them, despite his every intention to keep his heart guarded after the betrayal of his past. Ilara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let emotion overwhelm this fragile, honest moment between them. She reached for her charcoal and paper, her hands trembling slightly, and wrote him a simple message, one that captured everything she had felt during those long hours of waiting, watching the tower, for any sign of his return. She wrote that she had been afraid too, more afraid than she had been since the night she lost her voice, and that the fear had taught her something important, that whatever careful distance either of them had tried to maintain, it was already too late for both of them. Ronan read the note slowly, and when he looked up at her again, something had shifted in his expression, some final wall finally beginning to crumble. He did not speak, but he did not need to. He simply pulled her gently into an embrace, careful of his injured arm, and held her there in the quiet healer's quarters, the sounds of the recovering fortress fading into the background, as two people who had both learned to guard their hearts too carefully, finally allowed themselves a moment of genuine, unguarded connection. The village had been saved, and Damon Voss had been pushed back for now, but Ilara understood, even in the warmth of that embrace, that this had only been the opening move in a much larger conflict. Damon would not simply accept defeat and retreat quietly back to his own territory. He had shown his willingness to strike, and Ilara suspected, with a growing sense of dread, that whatever came next would test not only Ronan's strength as a leader, but the fragile, precious bond that had begun growing between them. A bond built entirely from silence, patience, and the slow, careful discovery of a heart that words alone could never have revealed. The victory at the village bought the fortress a fragile stretch of calm, though calm was perhaps too generous a word for the watchful tension that settled over the Blackthorn stronghold in the days that followed. Ronan doubled the patrols along every border, and messengers rode out daily to allied packs, seeking support should Daemon Voss decide to strike again with greater force. Alara watched all of this unfold with a growing understanding of how deeply interconnected the northern territories truly were, how one broken piece could ripple outward and threaten dozens of lives far beyond the walls of any single fortress. It was during this uneasy calm that a new complication arrived, one that had nothing to do with warriors or battle lines. A traveling merchant, part of a caravan permitted through the fortress gates to trade goods the pack could not produce through the harsh winter months, arrived carrying more than fabric and spices. He carried rumors, the kind that spread through trading routes faster than any official messenger could travel, rumors about the silent bride of the Blackthorn stronghold and the secrets she supposedly carried from her childhood home. Alara first became aware of these rumors when she noticed the household staff exchanging uneasy glances whenever she passed, a return of the suspicion she had worked so hard to overcome in recent weeks. Grace, ever honest, finally told her the truth during one of their afternoons in the healer's quarters, explaining that the merchant had spoken openly in the servants' hall about strange stories from the southern territories, tales of a massacre years ago in Alara's home region, one that had left an entire village destroyed, and only a handful of survivors, one of whom, the merchant claimed, had lost her voice that same terrible night. The color drained from Alara's face as Grace relayed this information, her hands going still over the bandages she had been folding. She had never told anyone within the fortress the true reason behind her silence, had allowed everyone to assume it stemmed from some unnamed childhood trauma, without ever revealing the specific horror that had actually taken her voice from her. Now it seemed that carefully guarded secret was unraveling, through gossip and rumor, threatening to expose a truth she had spent 6 years trying desperately to forget. She excused herself from the healer's quarters, and made her way to her room, her mind racing with fear and old, buried grief. The massacre the merchant spoke of was real and more devastating than any rumor could properly capture. She had been 12 years old, visiting distant relatives in a village near the southern border, when raiders from a rival territory attacked without warning in the middle of the night. She had hidden in a root cellar with 2 younger cousins, while the village burned above them, listening to sounds she could never fully describe, sounds that haunted her dreams even now, years later. When the raiders finally left and she emerged from hiding, she found devastation beyond anything a child should ever witness, and somewhere in that horror, her voice had simply stopped working, as though her body had decided some truths were too terrible to ever be spoken aloud. She had never told her own family the full details of what she witnessed that night, allowing them to believe her silence was simply grief, unwilling to burden them with the specific horrors that lived in her memory. Now, 6 years later, in a fortress hundreds of miles from that burned village, those buried memories threatened to surface again, twisted and exaggerated by rumor, into something that made her sound less like a survivor and more like someone hiding dangerous secrets. Corin, predictably, seized on these rumors with renewed suspicion. He confronted Alara in the corridor outside the council chamber, his voice sharp with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally found proof of what he had suspected all along. He demanded to know the truth about the massacre, about what exactly she had witnessed, about whether her silence hid knowledge of the raiders, who had never been identified or brought to justice for their crimes. His questions came rapid and relentless, and Alara found herself backed against the stone wall, unable to answer even if she had wanted to, her breath coming quick and shallow as old panic began to claw its way back to the surface. It was Ronan who found them there, drawn by the raised volume of Corin's voice echoing through the corridor. He took in the scene immediately, Alara pale and trembling against the wall, Corin looming over her with barely restrained frustration, and something dark and dangerous passed across his face, an anger Alara had not seen from him since the night they first met in her burning courtyard. He ordered Corin to step back, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument, and when Corin hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and suspicion, Ronan repeated the command with enough force that the beta finally retreated, though his expression remained tight with unresolved doubt. Ronan turned to Alara immediately, his anger giving way to gentle concern as he took in her trembling hands and pale face. He led her away from the corridor, away from curious eyes and straining ears, back to the private garden where so much of their fragile trust had first taken root. He did not press her for answers, did not demand to know the truth behind the rumors the way Corin had, and this patience, this willingness to wait for whatever she was ready to share, finally allowed Alara's racing heart to slow enough that she could gather her thoughts. She retrieved her charcoal and paper, her hands still unsteady, and began to write, slowly at first, then faster, as though the words had been waiting years for the chance to finally spill out of her. She told him everything: the raid on the village, the root cellar where she hid with her younger cousins, the devastation she witnessed when she finally emerged, the way her voice had simply vanished under the weight of what she had seen and could never unsee. She wrote until her hand cramped, filling page after page, and Ronan read each one carefully, his expression growing more somber, more understanding, with every word. When she finally finished, she handed him the last page, and waited, uncertain how he would respond to the full weight of her past, now laid bare before him. He set the pages down carefully, and reached for her hands, holding them steady in his own, and told her that nothing she had shared changed anything about how he saw her, except perhaps to deepen his respect for the strength it had taken to survive what she witnessed, and to build a life afterward despite it. He told her that her silence had never been a weakness or a secret to fear, but a wound that deserved patience and care, not suspicion, and he promised that he would speak with Corin himself, would make certain the rumors circulating through the fortress did not continue to twist her past into something ugly and false. True to his word, Ronan addressed the household staff directly that same evening, gathering them in the great hall and speaking with quiet authority about the dangers of spreading unfounded rumors, reminding them that every person within these walls, including his bride, deserved respect regardless of circumstances they could not control. He did not reveal the specific details Alara had shared with him, understanding instinctively that her story belonged to her alone to share or protect as she chose, but his firm defense was enough to quiet most of the whispering that had spread through the fortress in recent days. Corin, however, remained unconvinced, cornering Ronan privately later that night to argue that sympathy for Alara's past did not erase the danger of harboring secrets that could still be used against the pack by enemies seeking any advantage. Their argument, overheard partially by a passing servant and relayed later to Faye, grew heated enough that raised voices carried through the closed study door, though the specific words remained unclear. Whatever was said, Corin emerged from that conversation notably more subdued in the following days, though the suspicion in his eyes when he looked at Alara never fully disappeared. Alara, for her part, found an unexpected relief in finally having shared her truth with someone, even if that truth had emerged under difficult circumstances rather than her own choosing. The weight she had carried alone for 6 years felt somehow lighter now that Ronan knew, and though old grief still lived within her, she found herself sleeping more peacefully in the nights that followed, no longer haunted quite as fiercely by memories she had spent years trying to bury. But the rumors, even quieted, had planted a seed of awareness throughout the fortress and beyond its walls that would not be easily forgotten. Word of the massacre survivor, now living as the Alpha King's silent bride, spread further than Alara could have anticipated, reaching ears in territories far beyond the immediate concerns of the current conflict with Damon Voss. And somewhere among those listening ears, in a territory not yet touched by the current tensions, someone with far more dangerous intentions than idle gossip took careful note of exactly where Alara now lived, and began quietly considering how that knowledge might be turned to their own advantage in the difficult days that lay ahead. Spring arrived slowly in the northern mountains, melting the heavy snow in reluctant stages, and with it came a gradual easing of the tension that had gripped the Blackthorn stronghold since Damon Voss first tested the borders months before. No further attacks came, and the reports from Ronan's scouts suggested Damon had pulled his forces back to his own territory, though whether from genuine retreat or simple patience, no one could say for certain. For the first time since her arrival, Alara allowed herself to imagine a future here that did not involve constant vigilance and fear. The bond between her and Ronan had deepened steadily through the difficult months, built now on a foundation of shared truth rather than cautious distance. He sought her out daily, no longer simply during quiet evenings in the garden, but throughout his busy schedule, finding small moments to check on her, to share a meal, to simply sit beside her while he reviewed reports, comfortable now, in a silence that had once felt like a barrier between them, and now felt more like a shared language all their own. Ilara had grown remarkably skilled at communicating without words, developing a system of gestures and expressions that those closest to her had learned to read fluently. Grace understood her almost as well as if she spoke aloud, and Faye, despite her initially brisk manner, had grown genuinely fond of the quiet young woman who worked so diligently to earn her place within the household. Even some of the younger warriors, initially wary of the silent bride, had come to respect her steady presence, especially after witnessing her tireless work tending to the wounded following the battle at the village months before. Only Corin remained distant, his suspicion never fully extinguished despite Ronan's continued defense of her character. He was polite now, at least, no longer confronting her directly in corridors or interrogating her about rumors, but Ilara still caught him watching her sometimes during council meetings she was occasionally permitted to observe, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with unresolved questions. She had come to accept this distance as simply part of life within the fortress, a small shadow persisting even as most other aspects of her new life grew steadily brighter. It was on a mild evening in early spring, as blossoms began appearing on the trees in their private garden, that Ronan finally spoke words Ilara had begun to hope for, but had not allowed herself to fully expect. He led her to their familiar bench beneath the now flowering tree, and instead of settling into their usual comfortable silence, he took both her hands in his and told her, with a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him, that what had begun as a political arrangement forced upon them both had become something he never could have anticipated, something he now understood, without doubt, to be love. He told her that he had fought against this feeling for months, wary after the betrayal that had once nearly destroyed him, certain that opening his heart again would only invite further pain. But watching her steady strength through every challenge the fortress had faced, witnessing her courage and sharing her deepest wound with him, feeling the genuine care she showed, not just to him, but to every person within these walls who needed help, had slowly dismantled every wall he had built around his heart, until he found himself unable to deny what had grown between them, regardless of the risk it represented. Ilara felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with emotion too large for any words, spoken or written, to fully capture. She reached for her charcoal, but before she could begin writing, Ronan gently stopped her hand, telling her that for this particular moment, he did not need her words, that her expression alone told him everything he needed to know. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he closed the distance between them entirely, their first kiss beneath the blossoming tree, feeling like the culmination of months of careful, patient discovery. When they finally parted, Ilara rested her forehead against his, both of them smiling in the fading evening light, and for the first time since the night her father called her forward in that burning courtyard so many months before, she felt something close to complete peace, a sense that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them not as a silent bride, traded to secure a fragile treaty, but as a woman genuinely loved by the man beside her. News of their growing bond spread quickly through the fortress in the days that followed, and rather than the suspicion that had once greeted Ilara's arrival, most of the household responded with quiet warmth, having witnessed firsthand, over the preceding months, exactly the kind of person their Alpha King's bride truly was. Faye began speaking of Ilara with obvious pride, no longer simply managing a stranger's transition into fortress life, but genuinely championing a young woman she had come to care for deeply. Even some of the pack leaders, who had initially questioned the wisdom of a silent bride, now spoke favorably of her steady presence, recognizing the quiet strength she brought to a fortress that had weathered real danger under her watch. Ronan began speaking, cautiously at first, about the possibility of a formal mating ceremony, one that would bind them together not simply through the political necessity that had first brought them together, but through the deeper commitment that had grown between them since. Such a ceremony required specific traditions among his people, vows spoken aloud before the full pack, a requirement that had initially seemed impossible given Ilara's inability to speak. But Ronan, working alongside the pack's elder healers and historians, discovered older traditions, from generations past, ceremonies that allowed for vows to be expressed through action and written word, when circumstances required. traditions that had fallen out of common use, but remained valid within pack law. This discovery brought fresh hope to their relationship, a path forward that would allow Elara to be recognized not simply as Ronan's bride by political arrangement, but as his true mate by pack law and tradition, a distinction that mattered deeply within their world. Elara found herself looking forward to this possibility with genuine excitement, imagining a future here that felt increasingly solid and real, rather than the uncertain, fearful arrangement she had been forced into all those months before. But even as their happiness grew, careful preparations continued throughout the fortress, a reminder that peace remained fragile, despite the recent calm. Ronan maintained his patrols along the borders, unwilling to grow complacent despite Daemon Voss's apparent retreat, and reports continued arriving periodically about strange movements in the eastern territories, though nothing conclusive enough to suggest imminent danger. Elara noticed these ongoing precautions and understood, with the same steady awareness that had served her well since her arrival, that the peace they now enjoyed remained fragile, built on a foundation that could still crack under sufficient pressure. It was during a quiet afternoon, while helping Grace organize the healer's supplies in preparation for the coming planting season, that Elara received unexpected news that would test the fragile happiness she had recently found. A messenger arrived from her home village, carrying word from her sister Ivy, the first direct communication Elara had received from her family since her departure so many months before. She tore open the letter with trembling hands, desperate for news of the family she had been forced to leave behind. Ivy's letter, written in her familiar looping handwriting, carried both joy and worry in equal measure. She expressed relief and happiness upon learning, through traveling merchants and shared gossip, that Elara had found genuine care within the Blackthorn stronghold, that the political arrangement forced upon her had somehow blossomed into something resembling true affection. But the letter also carried troubling news, that their father Edwin had fallen seriously ill in recent weeks, weakened by a fever that had left him bedridden and increasingly frail, and that their family feared he might not recover without proper healing support, that their modest village simply could not provide. Elara read the letter twice, her joy at hearing from her sister, tangled painfully with fear for her father's health. She thought immediately of Grace's healing skills, of the well-stocked healers' quarters within the fortress, and she began composing in her mind the request she would need to make of Ronan, asking whether it might be possible to send healers south to help her ailing father, or perhaps even to arrange for her father to be brought north, where proper care could be provided more easily. She found Ronan in his study that evening, and though he immediately noticed her distress, reading it clearly in her expression before she even reached for her charcoal, he listened patiently as she explained the situation through written words, her hand shaking slightly as she recounted her sister's troubling news. He did not hesitate in his response, promising immediately that he would send his most skilled healers south alongside a small guard to escort them safely, understanding, without needing to be told how much her family's well-being meant to her. His immediate willingness to help, without any hesitation or political calculation, reminded Elara once again of exactly why she had fallen in love with this complicated, guarded man who had slowly revealed himself to be far more compassionate than the cold Alpha King who had first claimed her in that burning courtyard. She embraced him tightly, grateful beyond words for his support, and together they began making plans to send aid south, unaware that this journey, meant simply to help her ailing father, would soon become entangled in dangers far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The healers Ronan sent south departed within 2 days, accompanied by 6 warriors under the command of Nate, the same young guard who had first shown Elara kindness during her journey to the fortress so many months before. Elara watched them leave from the fortress gates, clutching a letter she had written for her father, filled with words she could not speak aloud, but hoped would bring him comfort during his illness, along with reassurance that she thought of her family every day, despite the distance now separating them. The following weeks passed slowly, filled with anxious waiting for news from the south. Elara distracted herself with her growing responsibilities within the fortress, spending long hours in the healer's quarters with Grace, continuing preparations for the planting season that would help sustain the pack through the coming year. Ronan remained attentive to her worry, finding small ways to offer comfort even amid his own busy schedule, though the ongoing uncertainty about Daemon Voss's intentions meant he could never fully set aside his vigilance regarding the eastern border. It was nearly 3 weeks after the healers departed That troubling news finally arrived, though not the kind Alara had feared. A single rider returned to the fortress alone, one of the warriors, who had accompanied Nate south, his horse exhausted, and his own expression grim with urgency. He was brought immediately to Ronan's study, and Alara, sensing something seriously wrong from the tension rippling through the household, followed close behind, unwilling to be excluded from news that concerned her own family. The warrior's report, delivered in halting, exhausted sentences, revealed a nightmare Alara had never anticipated. The healing party had successfully reached her home village and had begun treating her father, whose condition had shown early signs of improvement under Grace's carefully selected remedies. But 3 nights before this warrior's departure, raiders had struck the village in the darkness, moving with the same brutal efficiency Alara remembered from the massacre that had taken her voice years before. This time, however, the raiders had not simply attacked indiscriminately. They had specifically targeted her family's home, and in the chaos of that attack, her sister Ivy had been taken, dragged away by masked warriors whose colors matched no pack the villagers recognized, though whispered suspicion immediately pointed toward Damon Voss's territory. Alara's world seemed to tilt beneath her feet as she absorbed this information, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold her charcoal steady enough to write her desperate questions. Ronan caught her before her knees could buckle entirely, holding her steady, while the exhausted warrior continued his report, explaining that Nate and the remaining warriors had immediately begun pursuing the raiders, though the trail had grown difficult to follow through the dense southern forests, and no further word had arrived before this messenger was sent north to alert the fortress. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity as Ronan and Alara both realized the true purpose behind this brutal attack. Damon Voss, unable to strike successfully against the well-defended Blackthorn stronghold, had instead targeted Alara's vulnerable family, seizing her sister as leverage, understanding correctly that such an attack would strike at Alara's heart more effectively than any direct assault on the fortress itself. This was not simply an act of war against the Northern Pack, but a calculated, personal attack designed to fracture the peace treaty by threatening the very people it had been created to protect. Ronan moved immediately into action, calling an emergency council and beginning preparations to ride south himself with a significant force of warriors, determined to rescue Ivy and confront Damon Voss directly for this violation of the treaty they had all worked so hard to maintain. Alara, despite her overwhelming fear, insisted on being included in these preparations, refusing to simply wait helplessly within the fortress while her sister's life hung in the balance. Ronan initially resisted, unwilling to expose her to the dangers such a rescue mission would involve, but Alara's determination proved immovable, and eventually, recognizing the same steady courage that had first drawn him to her, he relented, agreeing to bring her south alongside the rescue party, though under careful guard at all times. They departed within a day, moving faster than the original healing party had traveled, Ronan's warriors pushing their horses hard through the remaining stretches of melting snow and muddy spring roads. Alara rode close beside Ronan throughout the journey, her mind consumed with worry for both her sister and her still recovering father, praying that Nate and his warriors had managed to track the raiders before any permanent harm could come to Ivy. They reached her home village on the 4th day, finding it still recovering from the shock of the attack, though relief rippled through the frightened residents at the sight of the Alpha King's forces arriving to help. Alara's father, weakened but conscious, wept when he saw his daughter again, though his relief was quickly tempered by anguish over Ivy's continued absence. He explained, through halting words that clearly cost him significant strength, that Nate's pursuit had led toward the eastern mountains, close to the border of Damon Voss's territory, though no further word had reached the village since their departure 5 days before. Ronan wasted no time, immediately organizing his warriors to continue the pursuit, following the same trail Nate's smaller party had taken toward the mountains. Alara insisted on joining this continued search, and though Ronan's protective instincts urged him to leave her safely in the village with her recovering father, he recognized that forcing her to remain behind while her sister's fate hung in the balance would be its own kind of cruelty, one he was unwilling to inflict on the woman he loved. They rode hard through difficult mountain terrain, following signs of Nate's earlier passage, until finally, as evening approached on the 2nd day of this renewed pursuit, they discovered Nate and his remaining warriors camped in a narrow valley, having successfully located the raiders' hidden camp just beyond the ridge ahead. Nate's report was grim but hopeful. Ivy remained alive, held captive within the raiders' camp, though heavily guarded, and Damon Voss himself had been spotted among the raiders, confirming beyond doubt his direct involvement in this brutal scheme. Ronan began planning their assault immediately, working alongside Nate and his most experienced warriors to devise a strategy that would allow them to rescue Ivy, while minimizing casualties among his own forces. Deborah, watching this careful planning unfold, felt a familiar helplessness creeping over her, the same helpless silence that had haunted her since the massacre years before, unable to contribute meaningfully to the rescue of someone she loved, forced instead to simply wait and hope that others could succeed, where her own limitations prevented her from acting directly. But as she watched the warriors finalize their plans, an idea began forming in her mind, one that drew on skills she had developed over years of careful, silent observation. She approached Ronan privately, using her charcoal to explain that she had spent years learning to move quietly, to observe without being noticed, skills born from necessity during her own childhood trauma that might now prove useful in approaching the raiders' camp undetected, perhaps allowing her to identify exactly where Ivy was being held before the main assault began. Ronan resisted this suggestion fiercely at first, unwilling to expose her to such direct danger, but Alara remained firm, reminding him through her written words that her silence, so often treated as a limitation throughout her life, could finally serve as genuine strength in this critical moment. After much difficult discussion, and with Nate's reluctant support for her plan, Ronan finally agreed, though he insisted on personally accompanying her partway toward the camp, remaining close enough to intervene immediately should anything go wrong. Under cover of deepening darkness, Ilara made her way carefully toward the raiders' camp, moving with the practiced silence she had honed through years of necessity, her heart pounding, but her hands steady with determined focus. She crept close enough to observe the camp's layout, identifying the tent where Ivy was likely held, based on the concentration of guards positioned nearby, and she noted, with careful attention, the patterns of the guards' movements, the moments when their vigilance seemed to waver, information that would prove crucial for the coming rescue. She returned to where Ronan waited, her information detailed and precise, despite requiring only written notes to convey it, and the warriors adjusted their assault plan accordingly, grateful for the crucial intelligence her silent courage had provided. As preparations for the rescue reached their final stages, Ilara felt a fierce pride swell within her chest, understanding fully, perhaps for the first time in her life, that her silence had never truly been a weakness to overcome, but simply a different kind of strength, one that had just proven capable of turning the tide in a rescue mission that would determine her sister's fate and confront, once and for all, the dangerous ambitions of Damon Voss. The assault began just before dawn, when the darkness still held enough cover for Ronan's warriors to approach the raiders' camp undetected, yet enough gray light was breaking over the eastern ridge to allow them to see clearly once the fighting began. Ronan had insisted, despite Ilara's protests, that she remain at a safe distance during the actual confrontation, positioned with two trusted warriors, whose sole responsibility was to keep her protected while the rescue unfolded. She agreed reluctantly, understanding the wisdom in his caution, even as every instinct urged her to be closer, to do whatever she could to help free her sister. The fighting erupted suddenly, warriors moving from the shadows with practiced coordination, catching Damon's raiders largely by surprise despite their supposed vigilance. Ilara listened to the sounds of battle from her position on the ridge, her heart pounding with fear for Ronan, for Nate, for every warrior who had ridden south to help rescue Ivy from captivity. She strained to see what was happening below, catching only glimpses through the trees, fragments of movement, and shouted commands that told her little about how the confrontation was actually unfolding. It felt like hours, though in truth, barely 20 minutes passed before one of her guards received word, relayed by a runner from the camp below, that the raiders had been overwhelmed, and Ivy had been found alive within the tent Ilara had identified the night before. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly collapsed against the nearest tree, tears streaming freely down her face as her guards helped guide her carefully down the ridge toward the now secured camp. She found Ivy sitting wrapped in a warrior's cloak near the center of the camp, shaken and exhausted but otherwise unharmed, and the sisters embraced tearfully, neither able to speak coherently through their overwhelming emotion, though Ilara's silence made no difference in this moment, when words would have failed either of them regardless. Ivy clung to her tightly, explaining through broken sobs that she had been terrified but had never given up hope that rescue would come, that she had somehow known Alara would find a way to help her, despite everything standing between them. But the celebration of Ivy's rescue was cut short, as raised voices drew attention toward the far side of the camp, where Ronan stood facing Daemon Voss directly, the two Alpha Kings finally confronting each other after months of escalating tension between their territories. Daemon, bloodied from the fighting but still defiant, sneered at Ronan with open contempt, accusing him of weakness for allowing a silent, broken woman to hold such influence over his decisions, mocking the very treaty that had first brought Alara into Ronan's life. Ronan's expression darkened with barely restrained fury as Daemon continued his taunting, but rather than responding with violence, he spoke with a controlled authority that carried far more weight than any shouted threat could have managed. He informed Daemon, in front of both their assembled warriors, that his attack on an innocent village, his kidnapping of an unarmed young woman, constituted a clear violation of every treaty governing conduct between the northern packs, violations serious enough to justify formal condemnation before the full council of Alpha leaders across the territories, a condemnation that would strip Daemon of much of the authority and alliances he had spent years building. Daemon's confidence wavered slightly at this threat, understanding the very real damage such formal condemnation could inflict on his standing among the other packs, but his pride would not allow him to simply surrender without one final attempt at justification. He turned his attention toward Alara, who had approached cautiously, with Ivy still held close beside her, and his expression twisted with something between curiosity and cruel calculation as he addressed her directly, demanding to know the truth behind rumors he too had apparently heard, about the massacre from her childhood, and whether she had witnessed anything that might identify the raiders responsible. Raiders some now suspected had connections to networks Daemon himself maintained. The question hung heavy in the tense morning air, and Alara felt every eye in the camp turned toward her, waiting for a response she could not verbally provide even if she wanted to. But something in Daemon's too careful phrasing, in the flicker of something calculating behind his taunting expression, sparked a memory Alara had buried so deeply she had never fully examined it, even in her own private thoughts. She remembered, suddenly and vividly, a detail from that terrible night years before, a particular emblem she had glimpsed on a raider's cloak as she hid in the root cellar, an emblem she had been too young and too traumatized to fully understand at the time, but one that now, seeing Daemon's own warriors and their distinctive colors, struck her with sudden, horrifying recognition. She reached for her charcoal with shaking hands, and though her writing was hurried and rough, the message she handed to Ronan was unmistakable in its implication. She had recognized Daemon's own colors among the raiders who destroyed her childhood village all those years ago, meaning Daemon Voss himself, or forces directly under his command, bore responsibility not only for this recent kidnapping and border aggression, but for the original massacre that had taken Alara's voice and destroyed an entire innocent village years before either of them had ever crossed paths. Ronan read the note, and his expression transformed into something colder and more dangerous than Alara had ever witnessed from him, a controlled fury that seemed to radiate from him with almost physical force. He turned to face Daemon directly, sharing what Alara had just revealed with his assembled warriors, and the mood within the camp shifted immediately, warriors on both sides, absorbing the weight of this accusation, understanding that if true, Daemon's crimes extended far beyond recent border skirmishes, into something far darker and more calculated. Daemon's composure finally cracked under the weight of this exposure, his denials growing increasingly frantic and unconvincing, as several of his own warriors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of truths they had perhaps hoped would remain buried. One younger warrior, visibly shaken, finally stepped forward and confirmed what Daemon had desperately tried to deny, admitting that Daemon had indeed orchestrated the massacre years before, as part of a broader campaign to destabilize the southern territories and expand his own influence, a campaign that had continued, in various disguised forms, right up through the recent attack on Alara's village and Ivy's kidnapping. The revelation sealed Daemon's fate among his own people, as much as it did among Ronan's warriors. Faced with open rebellion from warriors, unwilling to continue following an alpha capable of such calculated cruelty against innocent villagers, Daemon's authority crumbled within moments, his remaining loyal forces vastly outnumbered by those now openly refusing his commands. Ronan, recognizing the shift in power unfolding before him, offered those disillusioned warriors a choice: to formally renounce Daemon's leadership and submit to judgment before the full council of Alpha leaders, or to face immediate consequences for their continued loyalty to a leader, now exposed as a mass murderer and kidnapper. Nearly every warrior present chose the former option, effectively ending Daemon Voss's reign in a single, dramatic morning, though Daemon himself attempted one final, desperate act of defiance, lunging toward Ronan in a last effort to salvage his crumbling authority through violence. Ronan met this final challenge with the same controlled strength that had defined his leadership throughout the entire conflict, subduing Daemon quickly and decisively, ensuring he would face formal judgment before the council, rather than allowing this confrontation to end in the kind of bloodshed that might have simply created a martyr out of a man who deserved no such honor. As Daemon was bound and prepared for transport back toward the fortress to await formal council judgment, Elara found herself overwhelmed by the sudden, dramatic resolution to a truth she had carried silently for 6 long years. The uncertainty that had haunted her since childhood, the unknown identity of the raiders who destroyed her village and took her voice, had finally been answered, not through her own words, but through the courage to remember and share what she had witnessed. Courage that had ultimately helped bring a genuine monster to justice. Ronan came to her immediately once Daemon had been secured, pulling her into a fierce embrace that spoke more powerfully than any words could have managed, holding both her and Ivy close, as the full weight of the morning's events finally began to settle over the camp. He told her, quietly, that her courage in that moment, sharing a truth so painful and so personal in front of enemies and allies alike, represented perhaps the greatest strength he had ever witnessed from anyone, warrior or otherwise, and that whatever silence she carried within her, the world had just witnessed exactly how loudly that silence could still speak when the moment demanded it most. The journey back to the Blackthorn stronghold felt entirely different from the tense, urgent ride south that had brought them into the mountains just days before. Ivy rode close beside Elara, still recovering from her ordeal, but growing steadier with each passing mile, while Daemon Voss traveled bound and closely guarded near the rear of the procession, stripped now of the arrogance that had once defined him, replaced by a sullen silence that seemed almost fitting, given everything his cruelty had cost so many innocent people over the years. They stopped first at Elara's home village, where her father waited anxiously for news, his health continuing to improve under Grace's careful treatment, even as worry for his daughters had clearly taken its own toll on his recovery. The reunion between father and daughters brought fresh tears, relief washing over the small household as Edwin embraced both his girls, thanking Ronan repeatedly for the rescue his forces had made possible, his gratitude evident in every word, despite his still weakened voice. It was during this brief stop, while the warriors rested their horses and prepared for the final leg of the journey north, that Elara found herself alone with Ivy, in their father's modest home, surrounded by familiar objects from her childhood, that felt both comforting and strangely distant now, given everything that had changed since she left this house so many months before. Ivy studied her sister carefully, noting the changes in her bearing, the quiet confidence that had replaced the fearful uncertainty she remembered from before Elara's departure. Ivy asked, gently, whether Elara truly felt safe and cared for within the Blackthorn stronghold, whether the political marriage that had once seemed like such a frightening sacrifice had genuinely become something worth the sacrifice it demanded. Elara considered the question carefully, before reaching for her charcoal, wanting to give her sister an honest, complete answer, rather than a hurried reassurance. She wrote about the months of careful trust building with Ronan, about the friendship she had formed with Grace and Faye, about the moment in the garden when Ronan had finally spoken words of love that matched everything she had already come to feel for him herself. Ivy read the words with growing emotion, finally setting the pages aside to embrace her sister tightly, expressing genuine happiness that circumstances which had begun so painfully had ultimately led Elara toward a life filled with real connection and love, rather than simply enduring a marriage born from political necessity. It was, Ivy admitted, more than she had dared hope for when their father first handed Elara over in that burning courtyard so many months before, and hearing her sister's genuine happiness only deepened Elara's own gratitude for how far her journey had brought her. The procession continued north the following morning, and they reached the Blackthorn stronghold 3 days later, to find the entire household gathered to welcome them home, word of the successful rescue, and Damon's capture having traveled ahead of their return, through swift messengers Ronan had dispatched during the journey. Faye rushed forward to embrace Alara the moment she dismounted, her usual brisk composure entirely abandoned in her relief at seeing her safely returned, while Grace hurried to check on Ivy, ensuring the young woman had suffered no lasting harm from her frightening ordeal. Damon Voss was placed under heavy guard within the fortress, awaiting formal judgment from the Council of Alpha Leaders, that Ronan immediately began arranging, sending messengers to every allied territory, requesting their presence for what promised to be one of the most significant council gatherings in recent memory. The evidence against Damon, including testimony from his own former warriors alongside Alara's crucial identification of the raiders' colors from years before, left little doubt about the outcome such a council would reach, though the formal process remained necessary to ensure justice was served properly, and to prevent any future claims that Damon had been treated unfairly by a rival Alpha simply seeking to eliminate competition. In the days following their return, as the fortress settled back into a rhythm no longer shadowed by the constant threat Damon Voss had represented for so many months, Alara found herself reflecting deeply on everything that had unfolded since that terrifying night in her family's burning courtyard. She thought about the frightened, silent girl who had been traded to a stranger as payment for peace, and she recognized, with quiet wonder, how completely that girl had transformed into the woman she had become. Someone who had found her courage, not by regaining a voice that medicine and time had never restored, but by learning that silence itself could carry tremendous strength when paired with unwavering conviction. It was during a quiet evening in their garden, the same garden where so many pivotal moments of their relationship had unfolded, that Alara experienced something she had believed impossible for 6 long years. Sitting beside Ronan, watching the last light of sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, overwhelmed by gratitude for her sister's safe return, her father's recovery, and the genuine love she had found with the man beside her, she felt something shift deep within her chest, a sensation she had not experienced since the night her voice first disappeared. Her lips parted, and though it took tremendous effort, though her throat felt tight and unfamiliar with the sensation of forming words after 6 years of silence, a single sound finally emerged, quiet but unmistakable. She spoke his name, Ronan, her voice rough and uncertain but undeniably present, the first word she had spoken aloud since that terrible night so many years before. Ronan went completely still beside her, his eyes widening with shocked disbelief, before filling with tears he made no effort to hide. He turned to face her fully, his hands trembling as he reached for her face, cupping her cheeks gently, as though afraid this moment might somehow prove to be a dream, from which he would wake disappointed. He asked, his own voice thick with emotion, if she had truly spoken, if his ears had not simply deceived him in his desperate hope for exactly this kind of miracle. Alara nodded, tears now streaming freely down her own face, and she tried again, her voice still rough and unpracticed, but growing steadier with each attempted word. She told him, haltingly, that she loved him, that his patience, his willingness to learn her heart without ever demanding words she could not give, had somehow healed something within her that 6 years of silence had left broken. She explained, slowly finding her way back into a skill she had nearly forgotten, that speaking his name in that peaceful garden, surrounded finally by genuine safety and love rather than fear, had simply felt right in a way nothing had felt right since the massacre took her voice away. Ronan pulled her into his arms, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the beautiful unexpectedness of this moment. He told her, his voice still unsteady with emotion, that he had fallen in love with her silence, with the patient, careful way she had taught him to read a heart, without needing words to understand it. But hearing her voice now, however rough and unpracticed, however imperfect in this first return after so many years, he found himself loving her even more completely, grateful beyond measure that whatever had broken within her all those years ago had finally, in this quiet garden surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, begun to heal. Word of Alara's returning voice spread through the fortress with the same speed rumors once had, though this news carried nothing but genuine joy rather than suspicion or fear. Faye wept openly when she heard. Grace embraced her so tightly, Alara could barely breathe, and even Corin, upon learning the news, approached her with an expression of genuine humility, finally admitting that his months of suspicion had been misplaced, that the woman who had proven her courage and loyalty so many times over now stood before him, vindicated, in every way that mattered. Elara, practicing her still uncertain voice, told him simply that she forgave his doubt, understanding it had come from loyalty to Ronan rather than genuine malice, and that she hoped they could move forward now as allies rather than adversaries within the fortress they both called home. That night, as the fortress celebrated both the safe return of its people and this miraculous, unexpected gift of Elara's healing voice, Ronan gathered his closest advisors and made a quiet but significant announcement. The formal mating ceremony they had discussed months before, once complicated by traditions requiring spoken vows, would now proceed without any need for special accommodation, since his bride, against every expectation, had finally found her way back to her own voice, ready now to speak the vows that would bind them together, not simply as political allies, but as true, chosen mates, before their entire pack and the assembled leaders, soon to arrive for Daemon's formal judgment. The Council of Alpha leaders arrived over the following 2 weeks, their processions filling the fortress with a level of activity Elara had never witnessed since her arrival. Banners from a dozen different territories snapping in the mountain wind, as representatives gathered to address both the formal judgment of Daemon Voss, and, as word spread further, to witness the remarkable mating ceremony that would soon unite their host with his silent bride turned speaking mate. Daemon's trial proceeded exactly as the evidence suggested it would, facing testimony from his own former warriors, from the survivors of Elara's childhood village who had traveled north specifically to bear witness, and from Elara herself, who spoke before the assembled council, with a voice still finding its full strength, but carrying undeniable conviction. The leaders reached their judgment swiftly, and without dissent. Daemon Voss was stripped of his title and his territory, his lands divided among the neighboring packs who had suffered under his aggressive ambitions for years, and he was sentenced to permanent exile, forbidden from ever holding power or influence within any northern territory again. Elara's testimony before the council marked perhaps the most significant moment of the entire proceedings, not simply for the crucial evidence it provided against Daemon, but for what it represented more broadly. Here was a woman who had endured unspeakable trauma as a child, who had carried that trauma in silence for 6 long years, finding within herself not only the courage to survive, but ultimately the strength to speak truth before the most powerful leaders of her world. Truth that brought a genuine monster to justice and protected countless future villages from suffering the same fate her childhood home had endured. Several of the visiting Alpha leaders approached her afterward, expressing admiration for her courage, and Elara, still growing more comfortable with her returning voice, found herself able to accept these compliments with a quiet grace that surprised even herself. She had spent so many years believing her silence made her somehow less capable, less worthy of respect, within a world that valued bold words and confident speeches, and yet here she stood, having proven through action, and eventually through her own returning voice, that worth had never depended on how loudly one spoke, but on the truth and courage behind whatever words, spoken or otherwise, one chose to share. With Daemon's judgment settled, the fortress turned its full attention toward preparing for the mating ceremony, an event that would formally bind Elara and Ronan together, not as a political arrangement forced by circumstance, but as true mates, chosen freely, and confirmed now through months of genuine devotion. Faye threw herself into the preparations with characteristic energy, transforming the great hall into something magnificent, decorated with early summer flowers and banners representing both Ronan's territory and, in a thoughtful gesture that touched Elara deeply, the colors of her own birth family, honoring the heritage she brought into this union alongside her love for the Alpha King. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and warm, the kind of perfect early summer day that seemed almost too fitting for the significance of the occasion. Elara dressed carefully with Grace and Faye's help, wearing a gown that combined traditional blackthorn styling with subtle touches from her own southern heritage, a visual representation of the union about to be formalized between two people and, in a broader sense, two territories, finally finding lasting peace after generations of conflict. Ivy and her father, fully recovered now from his illness, had traveled north for the ceremony, along with representatives from Elara's home village who had become, through the shared trauma and triumph of recent months, something like extended family to the fortress that had once seemed so foreign and frightening to Elara upon her first arrival. Seeing her family present for this most significant moment of her life filled Ilara with a happiness so complete, it nearly overwhelmed her, as she prepared to walk toward the great hall, where Ronan waited. The ceremony itself unfolded with a beauty that seemed to capture perfectly the journey that had brought them to this moment. Ronan stood at the front of the packed great hall, dressed formally, but with an expression that revealed none of the cold, guarded authority he had shown the night they first met in that burning courtyard, replaced instead by open, unguarded joy as he watched Ilara walk toward him, flanked by her sister and father, surrounded by a pack that had once viewed her with suspicion and now regarded her as one of their most cherished members. When the moment came for the traditional vows that months before would have required special accommodation given Ilara's inability to speak, she instead stepped forward and spoke them herself, her voice still carrying the slightly rough quality of someone relearning a skill long dormant, but strong and clear enough that every person in the packed hall heard every word distinctly. She promised her loyalty, her partnership, her love, not as words memorized for the occasion, but as truths she had already proven through months of quiet strength and unwavering courage during the darkest challenges the fortress had faced. Ronan's own vows carried equal weight, spoken with the steady confidence of a leader, but softened by genuine emotion as he promised to continue learning her heart for the rest of their lives together, acknowledging before his entire pack that he had once believed love and vulnerability represented weakness, until a silent bride taught him, through patience and unwavering strength, that true strength required exactly the kind of open, honest vulnerability he had spent years avoiding after his previous betrayal. When the formal bonding was complete, sealed through both the traditional ritual and the joyful celebration that followed, Ronan addressed his assembled pack and the visiting leaders from across the territories, making a declaration that would echo through the northern lands for years to come. He named Ilara not simply his bride, the title she had carried since that first fearful night in her family's courtyard, but his true queen, his chosen mate in every sense that mattered, a woman whose courage and quiet strength had not only won his heart, but had ultimately helped secure lasting peace across territories that had suffered generations of conflict. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and laughter, with warriors who had once questioned Ilara's presence, now toasting to her health and happiness, with representatives from distant territories expressing hope that the peace secured through this union might finally allow the northern lands to flourish without the constant threat of conflict that had shadowed them for so long. Ilara moved through the celebration with a joy she could scarcely have imagined possible during those first frightened days within the fortress walls, her returning voice finding new confidence with every conversation, every laugh, every moment of genuine connection with the people who had become her true family. Late that night, after most of the celebration had finally quieted and the fortress settled into peaceful rest, Ilara and Ronan found their way back to the garden, where so much of their story had unfolded, sitting once more beneath the tree that had witnessed their first kiss and his declaration of love. She rested against him comfortably, watching the same stars that had witnessed her arrival at this fortress so many months before, and she thought about the frightened, silent girl who had once believed her voice, once lost, could never truly return, and who certainly could never have imagined finding a love this genuine, this complete, waiting for her within walls she had once feared as nothing more than a beautiful cage. Ronan pressed a gentle kiss to her temple and told her, quietly, that whatever the future held for their united territories, whatever challenges might still arise as they built a lasting peace together, he would always remember the woman who first taught him to listen, truly listen, before she had ever spoken a single word. And Ilara, resting peacefully in the arms of the man who had learned to read her heart when she had none of her own words to offer, understood that her silence had never been her weakness after all. It had been the very thing that led her, step by patient step, toward the truest, most complete love and belonging she had ever known, a love that would carry both of them, and the peaceful, united territories they now ruled together, into a future finally free from the shadows of the past.